Afternoon. Welcome to Drishti IAS. So today is 22nd of April and as always we'll begin with the Hindu analysis. So we have picked up the most important topics from this newspaper and we're going to discuss that. Okay. So is the audio clear? All right. So let's begin with the first news for today, which is that Sundarbans may be less blue than it seems. Sundarbans may be less blue. What is this less blue than it seems? So Sundarbans are actually storing blue carbon. So these are carbon sinks, right? So Sundarbans, they have these mangrove forests and they store blue carbon. Blue carbon is the carbon that is stored by coastal ecosystems, coastal or aquatic ecosystems. Like you'll have your mangroves, then you can have salt marshes, anything basically. So the coastal ecosystems, whatever carbon they store, that is blue carbon. So they are carbon sinks, they store a lot of carbon, and this carbon is actually stored on the surface also and below the surface also. So these are actually very important carbon sinks. They store more carbon than the normal forests also. So they store carbon over the surface also, a little carbon over the surface, like in the form of the dead leaves and branches and everything. But most of it is actually stored under underground, like in the soil. So because we have all these marshy areas, there's a lot of mud, there's a lot of sediment. So a lot of carbon is actually stored below the surface in these mangroves, in these mangrove forests. So that's why they are so important carbon sinks, because they store a lot of carbon inside, like underground, in this below the surface, because the decomposition is taking place slower, there is low availability of oxygen. So for a very long time this carbon stays below the surface. So they have a lot of blue carbon that is actually stored subsurface. And now we are seeing that this study is actually about a research that was published, which says that now the blue carbon storing capacity, or the carbon, whatever carbon that mangroves are storing, more carbon is actually being generated. So it is not able to, it does not have the capacity to store that amount of carbon. So it is storing whatever carbon it could store, but now more and more carbon is also being produced. And this research is actually telling us how is this additional carbon being produced and why the mangroves are suffering in in basically storing this carbon. So when we talk about the additional sources, first of all, Sundarban is the world's largest contiguous mangrove forest, right? It is on the confluence of Ganga and Brahmaputra rivers. So we have these mangrove forests. Now researchers from IISER Kolkata, they have reported that microplastics could interfere with the natural food web and alter the carbon budget of Bay of Bengal. So how is this additional carbon being generated? Because of microplastics. So microplastics are less than 5 mm in size. And this study actually showed that a lot of microplastics are found in the Sundarbans. Somewhere around 5 to 58 particles per liter are found in the Sundarbans. So there's an abundance of microplastics. And what is the problem with microplastics is that it releases something that is the dissolved organic carbon. So when the microplastics break down, they release dissolved organic carbon. And this DOC is actually the food for bacteria. It is the food for bacteria. So what's happening right now is that there's a lot of microplastic that is being found in Sundarbans, and these microplastics are majorly coming from the fibers, from the textiles, then also from the packaging material that we use, like polypropylene, and the PET bottles that we use for drinking, the water bottles, polyethylene terephthalate, and it actually increases during the monsoon season. A lot of river runoff. I told you it's at the confluence of Ganga and Brahmaputra. So there's a lot of river runoff, there's a lot of sediment that is coming in these regions, and that's why we see a lot of concentration of microplastics. There's an abundance of microplastics, and these microplastics, when they start decomposing, they generate something, they release something that is the dissolved organic carbon. It's the carbon that's basically dissolved in water. So it's like liquid food. It's food for the bacteria. These bacteria are in turn going to survive on that food. They'll grow and they'll multiply, and what are they going to produce? They're going to produce more carbon, right? So they are going to produce additional carbon. Additional carbon, one is coming from plastics. One, it is coming from plastics because plastics themselves, they are 90% carbon. So these microplastics are going to generate carbon. And secondly, from the microbes also. So these microplastics are giving rise to something that is called plastisphere. Plastisphere. So these are like floating ecosystems. Okay, there are microplastics, they act as ecosystems for these bacteria to thrive, because they are generating what? They're generating DOC, they're releasing DOC, and DOC is the food for bacteria. So bacteria is going to grow on that, it is going to multiply on that, it is going to increase their community. So it's like a bacterial community or a microbial community that is formed on these microplastics. That community is known as plastisphere. Okay, that community is known as plastisphere. So this additional carbon that we are talking about, this research is basically saying that whatever capacity the mangroves have to store carbon, that is not sufficient anymore, because more and more carbon, additional carbon is actually being generated. And that additional carbon is being generated from the plastics, these microplastics, they themselves are some 90% carbon. So they are generating carbon, they are releasing carbon, and the second is because of microbes. So these microbes, when they grow on plastispheres, they generate something that's biogenic carbon. So these are microbes, right? They will also respire, they'll also decompose. All these processes are going to release carbon. So this additional carbon is actually the artificial carbon. It's not the natural carbon that you're finding only in branches or leaves that have fallen and everything. This is additional carbon artificially that is being added to the ecosystem because of these microplastics. So we are getting biogenic carbon also, and we are getting carbon from plastics also. That's why it's this research is now saying that Sundarbans may not be as blue as it seems, because its capacity to store blue carbon will now basically fall down, because a lot of additional carbon is being generated. Okay, so what's blue carbon? The carbon that is stored in our coastal ecosystems, right? So that was for our first article. Then the second article says that the core sector activity contracts 0.4% in March 2026 on West Asia impact, and it is the worst in 19 months. So the core sector activity has fallen down. Now what is this core sector? You know, we have 8 core sectors. 8 core sectors which basically provide, or which basically strengthen all the industries, all the sectors that we have in our country. The agriculture sector, the industrial sector, there are actually thriving on 8 core sectors, very essential sectors, which are coal, crude oil, natural gas, refinery products like petrol and diesel, fertilizers, steel, cement, and electricity. These are the 8 core industries that we have, backbone of our economy basically. On these industries itself, all the other industries, the industrial sector, like all the other sectors, agriculture sector, industrial sector, construction sector, whatever it is thriving on all these 8 core industries. So this is also used in our index for industrial production. So it's this data is used here, and this data actually the data of all these 8 core industries, it was released by MCI, Ministry of Commerce and Industry, and it said that we have seen 4 out of these 8 sectors shrink in their activities. So 4 of the 8 sectors have been heavily impacted because of the West Asia crisis, because we know that there is a war ongoing between US, Israel and Iran. So because of that, a lot of our growth activity has also been hampered, and 4 of these 8 core sectors, 8 core industries have seen a fall in their output. So if you look at some data over here, so the core sector output, the complete combined output that we talk of the 8 core sectors, it fell by 0.4%. So the combined output fell by 0.4%, and 4 of the 8 sectors were the worst hit. Now this is the worst performance in 19 months. So in almost 2 years, this is the worst performance that we have seen of our core sectors. And the major driving force over here is the West Asia conflict. So you see how these conflicts, these global conflicts, they actually affect every economy. All the major economies of the world are going to be affected because it's a global supply chain. It's a complete disruption of the supply chain. And that's why if there's a conflict in some major areas like West Asia, it exports a lot of crude oil, it exports a lot of other fertilizers, chemicals and everything. So when there is a conflict, when there is a disruption in the global supply chain of our core of the core raw materials, the economy of all the other countries is also going to be impacted, and that is what we are seeing in India also. So the most important reason over here is our West Asia conflict. So if we look at the sectors that were the worst hit, so fertilizers was actually our worst hit sector. So out of the 4 sectors that we talked, which saw a reduction in their growth, a reduction in their output, fertilizers was the worst hit, because fertilizers, they depend on chemicals, they depend on these raw materials, and most of this was being imported from the West Asian countries, from Middle East. And because of the disruption in that global supply chain, we see that our fertilizer sector saw a major reduction in its growth. And this in turn is going to affect what? The agriculture sector, right? So the chemicals that we were importing from these countries, they have seen a reduction. They have seen actually, they have shrunk, and because of that, our fertilizer sector was actually the worst hit. And this in turn is going to affect our agriculture sector. Then coal imports also went down, because we want to rely on other renewable sources of energy. So the coal supply also went down. Crude oil, we know, crude oil has been massively affected. We import a lot of crude oil. We import, in fact, 85-90% of our needs of crude oil from outside, and mostly it comes from Middle East, from the West Asian countries. So crude oil imports have gone down significantly. Then electricity sector also saw a decline. However, it was not as huge as the fertilizer sector or the core sector or the crude oil sector, but the electricity sector also saw a decline of somewhere around 0.5%. Because all these things, if this is being reduced, the electricity sector is also going to face some amount of consequence. So that is what happened over here also. But fertilizer sector was the worst hit sector. Steel growth. Now there are two other things which saw an increase, but their growth fell. So they did not, like, the growth did not completely decline, or they did not see a contraction. They grew, but they grew at a slower pace in comparison to the previous year's data or even the previous month's data. So the steel growth fell to an 18-month low of 2.2%, and the cement growth fell to a 17-month low of 4%. Okay, so the steel growth also fell, the cement growth also fell. So these things are also happening because the construction sector is getting weakened. Right now, a lot of investment is not happening in the infrastructure projects. Not a lot of construction is taking place. So steel and cement sectors, or steel or cement industry, they also saw a decline. So they also hit their 18-month and 17-month low. All in all, they increased, but their relative growth was actually lower. So some core sectors, they have been severely impacted because of the West Asian conflict. But there was one well-performing sector also, and that was the natural gas sector. The natural gas sector saw actually an increase in its output by 6.4%. Because the government, it has been encouraging these companies, industries to actually produce more and more of natural gas, right? Because we want to reduce our dependence on crude oil, we want to reduce our import dependence, so we are investing more in the natural gas sector. We are wanting the output to increase in the natural gas sector. So this was one sector which saw a great, a robust growth. Other than that, all the other sectors, the major sectors, they saw a decline, and this is happening because of the global supply chain disruption in the West Asian region. Okay, so next we'll move on to the third news for today. which says that development initiatives, capacity building will be in focus at the 4th India-Africa Forum Summit. So the 4th India-Africa Forum Summit is all set to happen somewhere around May 2026. And this is important because this is being hosted by New Delhi. So it's happening in India. It is also important for a couple of other reasons. We'll look at that also. But New Delhi is all set to host this summit, this 4th summit, India-Africa Summit in May 2026. So New Delhi hosts the 4th India-Africa Forum Summit in May 2026, and this is the 4th. It's very important actually because the gap between the 3rd and the 4th was somewhere around 10 years. So the first one happened in 2008, second one in 2011, third in 2015, and now in 2026. After a gap of 11 years, we'll see the 4th summit happening. So India and Africa, they've had close ties, they've had good ties, but over the last 1 decade or so, there, a lot of connection has not been made, and this summit also could not take place for the last 11 years. So this is very important in itself, that after 11 years, India is going to host this summit, and we are majorly going to focus on our development initiatives, because in this decade also, the needs of both India and Africa have also changed. Earlier, Africa was majorly relying on loans, on aids and grants, but now it is mostly relying on development initiatives. Development initiatives like capacity building, like the other countries. For example, India, instead of giving loans and grants to Africa, short-term loans, long-term loans and grants to Africa, it should be investing more in the development projects. It should be investing in the skill building of Africa, in technology, technological transfer to Africa. So these are some long-term initiatives that Africa is looking at, because India and Africa's needs are also changing. It has a youth population. So now the ties also, and the type of, or the dynamics that we have in our ties, they also need to change. So this 4th IAFS has the additional dimension, as it is being organized against the backdrop of supply chain disruption that has gripped the global economy following the US-Israel attack on Iran. We just now saw that because of the global disruption in West Asia, global supply chain disruption, all the economies are going to suffer. India not alone. All economies are suffering because they are reliant on that supply chain. So this is significant because in the background of that disruption, we are actually looking at diversifying our options. And significantly, India and Africa's ties, they have been strong. So they have been robust. In spite of the disruption that we see in West Asia, our ties with Africa have been robust. So we need to build on that, because we need to diversify our options, right? So it's extremely important because this conflict is ongoing, this war is ongoing. So we need to strengthen our ties with Africa, and India needs to connect, build and revive with Africa. After 11 years, this summit is happening. So we need to build more and more on our ties with Africa. We need to fulfill our FDI commitments. So I told you that the dynamics have to change. We now have to rely on developmental projects. So Africa is no longer, really interested in short-term projects. It wants that companies come and they invest in Africa. Like India should set up these industries, these companies, these factories in Africa, so that it can also help the local economy of Africa to grow. It can give jobs to the African people. These are the types of long-term developmental plans that Africa is looking at. No longer just at, in providing short-term loans and grants and stuff like that. It wants developmental projects, it wants capacity building, it wants skill building and technology transfer. So our FDI commitments have to be fulfilled. Right now, the data says that whatever commitments, FDI commitments we have made to Africa so far, only 40% of that has actually been fulfilled by India. So there's a major lacuna here also, 60% gap, and this in turn leads to trust deficit, right? And that's not something that we can afford with our global partners. So we promised that we are going to invest so and so amount in Africa, we are going to do so and so investment, but we fulfilled only 40% of that. So there's a 60% gap that needs to be fulfilled in order to break the trust deficit. And we see that other partners, Western countries, are also very much interested in Africa because of the demographic dividend and because of the resource rich regions that it has. China is also very much interested in Africa. So at this time, India really cannot afford to not fulfill its commitments. So for that, we'll require a lot of support from our industries, like the government industries as well as the private players also, because no longer is small and medium enterprise investment going to work in Africa. It is now looking at long-term big projects, because all the other countries, all the Western countries and China also is investing big time in Africa. So we also need to change our strategy over here from the small and medium enterprise investment to bigger investments, to longer investments, large scale investments. And that is actually some type, the type of investment that will help the African economy, local economy also to grow. And only then we'll be able to strengthen our ties with Africa. And Africa is really important, as I told you, because of the resources that it has. And right now, the global disruption that we see, we absolutely need to diversify our options, and with countries that we have had good ties. So with such countries, and at global level also now, Africa is getting a lot of recognition. So these African countries are getting a lot of recognition at the UN and all the other international organizations. So we need to be very, very mindful of our ties with Africa, and that's why when the summit will be hosted in May 2026, all such developmental projects are going to be discussed. Okay. Now moving on to the next article, it says that India must draw a red line on US unilateral sanctions. So it is high time, article says that it is high time that India draws a red line on US sanctions. Now what is this red line? Red line is actually our refusal and resistance against the unilateral sanctions imposed by the United States. So we know that US has been imposing a lot of sanctions, trade sanctions on us. There is a trade war that keeps on going. So we need to firmly resist this thing. We need to firmly draw a red line. We need to push back on things, which is something we're not doing in full capacity at the moment, but that's something that we need to do. Red line meaning that we need to refuse and we need to resist. We really need to push back on these unilateral sanctions that are being imposed by the US, because what is the US doing right now? It is actually doing a weaponization of trade. Now in the modern era, you will see there is a weaponization of almost everything. So not weaponization, not just using real weapons and getting on the battlefield and using weaponry on each other, but weaponization of trade, weaponization of finances, weaponization of technology, weaponization of internet. Everything is happening. We're using everything as a weapon. It simply means that we are using trade as a weapon. Weaponization of trade meaning that we are using trade as a weapon against other countries. Like we are saying that you need to do so and so things, if not we'll impose these sanctions on you. So this is what, this is also a weaponization. You're using trade as a weapon against a country. So this is what US has been doing. It has been stopping India, or it has been forcing India to not import oil from Russia. If we do that, it is going to impose these sanctions on us, these sanctions and even penalty on us. So these things have been happening, and they have been happening unilaterally by the US. And these are not sanctions that have been imposed by any international organizations, or they have been approved by any international organizations. Like these are not UN sanctions or WTO sanctions. They are simply sanctions that have been imposed by the US. So these are unilateral sanctions, and we need to draw a red line right now, because it's high time that we start pushing back on such things. Now, why is this a problem for India? Why do we need to push back? First and foremost, it is affecting our sovereignty, right? We are a sovereign nation. We have the right to decide what is best for us in our national interest. So no other country should be influencing us to do that. So it is affecting our sovereignty. It is affecting our strategic autonomy. We have the power to decide what we need to do. We cannot come under the influence of any other power block. No other country has, can take decisions for us or can influence us to do certain things under any threat or under any influence of power or under any threat of weaponization of trade or anything, because it is against our strategic autonomy. It is upon us to decide what we need to do and what we will not do. Secondary sanctions. Now, these are the types of sanctions that are being imposed by the US. It is very important that India pushes back on secondary sanctions. And what are these secondary sanctions? These are sanctions that are actually being imposed on a third party, because that third party is doing trade or it is doing any economical exchange with a party that is not an ally to the US. For example, in this case, US and Russia, they are at direct loggerheads, right? Now, India in this case is actually a victim of a secondary sanction, because it has been said that if India keeps on importing oil from Russia, then in that case a sanction is going to be imposed. So, India here is a third party. There is no direct conflict between US and India. There is no direct war or something that is ongoing between US and India, but India is actually a victim of secondary sanction. And not just India, any other developing nation also. Basically, any country that is going to import a lot of oil from Russia will be under this secondary sanction. So secondary sanctions are these sanctions that are imposed on the third partners, on other countries who do trade or who do any sort of economical exchange with a country that is not an ally of the US, right? So we have secondary sanctions. Then this is also affecting our energy security, correct? So you know that we are heavily dependent on import, 85-90%, like we are mostly dependent only on import for our energy needs, for our crude oil needs. We are looking at other options, but other options are not the most feasible ones at the moment. So it affects our energy security also. We need to decide what is best for us, from where can we get cheap oil, from where can we get best quality oil, or from where can we get the alternatives. We shouldn't be acting under the influence of any other country, because it is against our energy security. If we stop buying cheap oil from Russia and we start looking at other expensive options, that is going to affect our economy. Who's going to pay for that? India itself needs to pay for that. So it is going to affect our energy security also. It is going to affect our economy also, and this is happening. That's why it is high time that the article says that we need to now start resisting such change. Then double standards. Double standards or hypocrisy is something that has been called out by India time and again, which says that these Western countries, they are asking us to stop importing Russian oil, but still many Western countries are doing trade with Russia. They are importing oil, they are importing other stuff with Russia. So if you are doing trade with Russia, why are you punishing other countries who are doing trade with Russia? Either you stop doing all sorts of trade with Russia, right, and then set a standard. But here we are saying that these double standards and hypocrisy rules, or this hypocrisy basically is being shown by these Western countries, being shown by US in this case. So that's why also India, it's very important that India now starts resisting. Now, these sanctions are not approved globally. So I told you these sanctions are not approved by any international organization. They are not approved by the UN, or they are not approved by the WTO. They are against, in fact, the principles of WTO. So they are against all these international organization principles, and these are unilateral sanctions that a country itself, just to assert its power, is imposing on us. And it's against the WTO principle. So WTO principle says what? That you need to be fair in the trade rules, fair and just in the trade rules. So the trade between economies, it should not favor any economy. There's a most favored nation principle also. So it should not favor any other country, or any it should not provide any extra special treatment to any country. Basically, the trade between countries should actually be fair, it should be transparent, it should be just. But these unilateral sanctions, are they fair? Are they just? No, because of all these reasons that we listed here, that it is against the sovereignty of a nation, it is against the strategic autonomy of a nation, then it is against the energy security of a nation, it is not approved globally, and it is also showing double standards. There are also signs of hypocrisy that are being shown by the US. So it's against all these things. That's why it's important that India now starts taking a stand. So what can India do right now? There are a couple of options that we can look at. First is negotiation, dialogue and diplomacy. right? First is negotiation. Get on the start negotiating with the US. That is something that we have been doing. That's why there are talks of these trade deals, free trade agreements to be signed with US. So these things are happening. This is the most it's actually the safest route that we can take. That's of negotiation. Then we also have some legal options that we can raise this concern at the WTO, because it is against the WTO principles. So we can take this legal route and we can raise this concern at the WTO also, but our first goal over here would be, the first option over here would be to first negotiate, because once things go to WTO, things are going to be delayed and a lot of other factors are going to come in place. Like, it's not like that justice is going to be served right in time. So a lot of delay will be happening, a lot of global, name calling and stuff like that. A global level distortion of image will also be happening for all the parties involved. So the first thing, the safest option is actually to negotiate bilaterally, and if things do not work out, then definitely a legal route can be taken. Then even more severe is actually a retaliation. Retaliation is like, instead of unilateral sanctions, these sanctions can become bilateral. We also start imposing sanctions on the US. We also start imposing these tariff and these different types of sanctions and everything on US. So this is something that India can do. We can look at retaliation. This is more aggressive. Retaliation is an aggressive form of coming back, basically. But in the long-term strategy is actually to reduce our dependence. Like, all in all, it is actually about reducing the dependence, because we are looking at the global situation right now, and like, US definitely cannot be called a trusted ally in India's case, because of all the reasons that we have seen so far, and because time and again it has been proved that US cannot really be trusted for India. In some matters it can, in some matters it cannot be. So what is the long-term strategy? Can we keep on relying on one country or a couple of countries? No, the long-term strategy is to reduce our dependence and become self-dependent, become self-reliant. That is why the government keeps on placing so much importance on Atmanirbhar Bharat, on the vision that it has on making India self-reliant, because it's very, very important. We see a lot of conflict happening. We see a lot of, we are actually we are actually a victim of secondary sanctions over here. There's no direct war between India and US, but we are still under these secondary sanctions. So we are a victim of such kinds of sanctions. Then in the West Asia, a lot of conflict is happening. We are a victim of that also, the global supply chain disruption. So in the long term, our goal is actually to reduce the dependence, on all these foreign nations and become more and more self-reliant, right? So these were some important articles that we discussed from the newspaper. And now we look at a practice question for prelims. If there's any doubt or something, you can ask. Okay. So let's move on to the practice question for prelims. But before we do that, very quickly, let me tell you that our Civil Services Day sale is now live. So this sale is actually live from 21st to 23rd of April, which means it is going to be live till tomorrow. And here you are going to get up to 50% off on all online courses, pen drive courses and test series, and a flat 25% off on books, DLP and magazines. Okay, so the sale is live. It will remain live till 23rd of April. If you have any queries, please call us at 87501 87501, and you can also download the Drishti Learning app. Right? Now moving on to our practice question. With reference to blue carbon, consider the following statements. 1. It refers to carbon captured and stored by terrestrial forest ecosystems. 2. It is mainly associated with coastal ecosystems such as mangroves, seagrasses, and salt marshes. 3. It is stored only in the biomass above the ground and not in the soil. Which of the statements given above is or are correct? A. 1 and 2 only, B. 2 only, C. 1 and 3 only, or D. 1, 2 and 3. So please attempt this question and provide your answers in the comment section. Thank you for watching, and we will meet tomorrow in a new video.